So when there's a negative externality and private bargaining is either impractical or infeasible, then the obvious solution is to use government policies. And there are a number of possible government policies that can be used to put in place. Um, Sometimes one is more feasible than another. Sometimes one will be more effective than another. So one option, of course, is just to put a regulation of production, right? We can cap at the socially optimal amount. The problem with a cap is that, um, for one, it may not provide the right incentives in terms of managing the externality that the way you want it to be managed. And two, you might not know what that socially optimal amount is, right? And so if that's the case, then a cap is going to be difficult. One example where a cap is often used is when we decide that we don't want to use a product at all, right? So if we think about the use of lead in paint and gasoline, in the 1970s, we basically decided, hey, there is enough evidence that lead causes severe problems as a neurotoxin that we're just not going to use it in these products at all, and it was banned. And you can think of that as basically a cap at zero, deciding that the socially optimal amount is zero. Um, Number two is doing a Pigovian tax or subsidy, right? And so if something has a negative externality, if we put a tax on it, uh, then we can reduce the amount that is produced, and we'll go back to our banana example in a minute. If something has a positive externality, then we may want to subsidize it. So if you think about public education, um, that is you can think of as a subsidy on education because education has a lot of positive externalities. And then three is enforcing compensation for affected parties. And so you can think of that as sort of the tort system in courts where you're able to sue somebody if you can show that you were damaged by their actions. That's not always the most efficient way to do things, and usually governments rely on one of the first two, and economists usually recommend the Pigovian tax or subsidy, named for Cecil Pigou. So let's look at a pollution tax. So going back to our banana example, remember they would produce, banana plantation owners would produce at point A because they're equating price with their marginal private cost, whereas we would want them to produce down here, um, equating price with the marginal social cost. And so the idea of the tax is to impose a tax that is equal to the marginal external cost, so that firms would add that to their marginal private cost and then produce at this socially optimal amount. And that forces producers to face the full cost of their decisions. And so if we think about, a common problem that we have right now is with carbon, right? We're putting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere through energy production, through cars, through farming. And so one recommendation that a lot of economists have is to put a carbon tax on carbon, no matter how it's produced, right? So whether it's burning gasoline, um, animals, cattle, uh, burning coal. If you put a tax on carbon, then that would reduce the amount, as long as it was the appropriate size tax, and you could, of course, adjust it, that would reduce the amount of carbon that is emitted. Another possibility is compensation, right? And so you could say, all right, well, the plantation owners have to pay the fishermen for each ton produced, and then you would make it equal to the difference between the marginal private cost and the marginal social cost, and then fishermen are fully compensated, right? And then in this case, the banana growers are the ones who have to pay because basically it's saying that the fishermen have the right to have clean water. Um, and and then the fishermen receive the payment instead of the government, which, depending on your view of what the government does with the money, could be better or worse. So one option is a tax, another option is compensation, right? Remember that first option was to say, hey, you can only produce 38,000 pounds of banana, but finding that actual number could be very difficult. So there Similarly, with private bargaining, there are practical limits to these policies. One, is, of course, is missing information, right? And so if you can think of, the biggest problem with pollution throughout the Industrial Revolution for a large part of it is that we just didn't know how bad some of these things were. We didn't know the problem with sulfur dioxide. We didn't know the problem with lead. We didn't know the problem with, carbon. And so it wasn't until we learned some of this information that we could decide, okay, well, we need to regulate it, we need to put a tax on it. And knowing the exact amount is difficult. Um, Measuring these things is extremely difficult, right? What's the cost of climate change due to, burning coal and other global, warming gases? It's hard to know. What was the cost of using lead? Very difficult to know because these costs go out over, decades and even centuries. And so knowing what that cost is can be really difficult. And then, of course, there are often powerful interests involved that don't want to have to pay more. So whether that is the banana plantation owners in our example, or whether it is the oil and gas companies, or it's the lead companies, lobbying is a very effective way of getting what you want in these types of situations. And so that can make it difficult to get to the Pareto efficient outcome. So why do these sort of externalities, whether they're positive externalities or negative externalities, occur? A lot of the reason is due to incomplete contracts, and often it's not because these contracts are poorly written, it's because they can't be completely written. And so incomplete contracts mean that there's going to be some costs and benefits to people that are not taken into account when the production decisions are made. And so if they and often that is because those external costs or benefits are not verifiable, right? Or they're asymmetric, and so they are known by one party but not the other. If you think about, somebody getting educated, what's the benefit to me of providing everybody with a primary education or a secondary education? Well, that's really hard to say. There is definitely some benefits in terms of increased production, reduced crime, etc. But it's hard to say what those benefits are exactly. And so often it's really next to impossible to use contracts and property rights. And oftentimes what governments have to do is, through some combination of um, quotas or reductions or just banning something, taxes, compensation, try to work towards the Pareto efficient outcome, keeping in mind that there will always be interests that want to push us away from that Pareto efficient outcome.